So this is kind of where we left off, right? We really had kind of gotten our texturing to the point where we wanted to. I didn't texture every little part with stencils and stamps just because there's a point where I covered everything I wanted to in terms of techniques and ideas. And, we just wanted to get you kind of to finishing this up. Now, I'm going to kind of maybe move this down a little bit. Remember, you can always kind of move this down a little bit to see your view better. One of the things we could also do, of course, is put a floor in here. So I'm going to quickly go back to modeling. Right? We could go 4 for object. And then, of course, we can go to add, right? Mesh and plane, right? So to add a floor is pretty easy, right? You just go to add mesh plane. There it is right there. We can hit R for scale. And this will do an object mode. If you wanted to go to 3 and do Control A for face mode, of course you can do that as well, right? And then R for scale. So it's kind of up to you on how, if you want to scale the whole object, you can. But you can also just go in and scale the face. The big advantage that would give you is that the object itself is not scaled above 1 in any transform areas. You're scaling the polygon itself. And then, of course, W for move. But remember, R for scale, middle mouse button, really easy to uniform scale it. And, of course, W for move, we can grab that blue arrow, the Z-axis to move down. And now we've got a floor. Maybe R for scale just to make it a little bigger. It is kind of over in its own collection. Remember, you can always just left-click drag to put it into this collection. Right? You can always name these collections just like you can name the objects. Right? We can double-click on that, say floor. And we can double-click on this and call it geometry. Something like that, right? So remember, you have some kind of options for where and how you can name stuff. Remember, this is where the lights are at, right? So I have my light visible, and the light's visible here. But now I should go back to shading, and now we can see there's a floor. And what I want to do is I want to start to render this in cycles, right? Eevee's pretty awesome. We have it already on right here. I can easily go to scene lights, right? And you can actually see that even in this view, you can see that the actual lighting is not bad. The bloom's a little bit intense, right? So you can always kind of go back in here and bring that intensity down a little bit, maybe bring the radius down a little bit. So remember, you have these controls in your bloom section. You can even click on your floor, and this kind of has its own material, or you could put kind of a new material on there for it, right? So we can click on that, call it floor, right? So remember, as long as that's selected, you can actually click on new material, give it a name, and we can easily just kind of go to base color, just turn this down a bit. You see how it's just less intensely bright, right? So remember, you can create your own material for the floor. Now, our final render is going to be with cycles, not Eevee, right? So remember, there's that little kind of microwave briefcase-looking icon, render your render properties. Right now, it's using Eevee as your rendering options. You just need to make sure that, because remember, that's just regular shaded. That is basically material preview, which if you have Eevee set up, is Eevee, right? It's showing your real-time rendering. If you click on this little V, see how scene lights makes a difference? You can also have scene world, which in this case I usually like to have off, just so we can kind of get the bounce light a bit better. So remember, you have these cool controls in here that you could use. You can even change this to something else, right? But our final render, we really want to be cycles, right? So we can always, in this little kind of box right here, go to rendering engine cycles. And what we could do is the very last one, right? Because there's wireframe. There's regular shaded, which does give us our matte cap stuff. So if we want to use matte caps, these different matte caps, we can. There's basically material preview, which is your full real-time render with Eevee. So normal mapping, metal, kind of transparency maps will show up, all that stuff. And this last one is your kind of full renderer, right? And it's going to use cycles, right? And so you can actually start to see what the full renderer will look like, right? So now we've got cycles on. One of the things, remember, that we could do is go to right here, right? And you'll see that there is kind of this control right here. So there is kind of a world properties, right? And one of the things we could do is we could go to the color, right here, kind of color dot. And it brings these up, and you'll see one of them is, let's see, where is it at? Environment texture. And what this does is it creates this background for us. In this case, it's that's not the one I wanted, though. Let's click on that again. Sky texture, my bad. Environment texture, though, would allow you to load an image in, right? So you could load a picture in for your background. But if you click on that yellow dot again, you can actually replace it with sky texture. And sky texture automatically puts in the Nishida sky background, right? So it's actually giving you a sunlight source, right? So in fact, you would probably want to delete this light source. So delete it, and then you only have the one light source. And it actually gives you control over a sky environment. So one of the things we could do is we could play with like sun elevation. And you see that can get us more to noon. If we keep going, right, we can actually, if we go down and down and down, we can get more to sunset, right? So let me go up there. You could do sun rotation, which will be the actual kind of positioning of the light. So you can get something kind of more like that. Maybe bring the sun elevation up a little bit more. So remember, by default, when you go to the little kind of world properties here, right, kind of the, well, it looks like a world, right? It looks like a kind of a red magenta world. There's this area surface. You click on color, right, and you could pick the sky texture option, right? Sky texture. It automatically puts a Nishida in, but there are other ones, right? So you do have kind of different options if you want to use those. I find that the Nishida is kind of gives you the most flexibility and versatility. You'll notice that there is strength. So if I want, I can go down here and say, hey, type that to 0.5 to make it a little less intense, right? So you can definitely get it less intense. And we could keep playing with things like rotation. So if we wanted our shadow and our normal map to pop a little bit better, it's probably better to have your light coming more from this direction, right? But you'll see right off the bat, we get this kind of neat little kind of background that's kind of got your horizon, right? And depending on how much you turn sun elevation down, you get closer and closer to sunset, right? Noon, sun rotation is kind of the angle where the sun's coming from. And you can even play with some of these other options here, right? You can bring the sun intensity down a little bit more. So there's lots of overall neat controls you can use for this that you can take advantage of, right? So remember, just kind of that little pick sky texture, not environment texture. I always forget that when I initially come back there. I'm like, environment. Oh, wait, no, sky, right? But the kind of magenta reddish kind of world icon in your properties, that's going to give you access to surface, color, sky texture. It brings this up. And you notice we can only really see this when we have our viewport shading turned to the actual last one, right? So only this last one will show it up. And of course, you set this to be cycles. Remember, one of the cool things in cycles is denoising. So if you go right back up to kind of little, it kind of looks like a briefcase microwave, right? It's above the one that looks like a printer icon, right? So it's the second one down, right below the wrench and the screwdriver. Denoising, right? And here's your rendering engines, right? EV, cycles, those are the kind of the big ones. Cycles is your final render, though, that uses full ray traced global illumination. EV is much more of a real-time renderer. It's a nice one, and it's only going to get better. They're integrating Vulkan. Eventually, they're going to integrate real-time ray tracing. But Cycles is kind of the full final renderer. You can open up denoising, though, and we don't really need it in the viewport here, although you can. But I'll turn on for the renderer, and I'm just going to use open image denoise. But if you have optics on your NVIDIA card, you can take advantage of that. And that'll just get rid of some of that noise that shows up. If you feel like you'd like your normal maps to be more intense, remember, you can just click on the object here in the viewport, right? So this is a full, excellent interactive renderer. And you can just go in here and say, hey, I'm going to take that guide. I'm going to make the normal map stronger, right? Maybe the strength should be 2.5 for the normal map for the body. Makes it a little more intense. I can go to this one here. We could kind of find the normal map there. Maybe turn that up to 2.5. It kind of depends on how intense you want the normal map to be. Remember, that's all editable. And one of the last things we can start to do here before we do our final render is we want to make sure that our camera is set up properly. So one of the things I do, and you've seen this in other videos, is we click on this guy right here, that little V on the side that pops out. And we go to View, and you can lock to the camera view, right? And then if you go to View up here, you can go Cameras, Active Camera, and now you'll see that that's the actual view that we're going to render from. But you'll notice that you can use your navigation, right? Your normal navigation. If you don't do this, you can't use regular Blender navigation, right? Which is actually my navigation, if you're using Industry Paddle. So once you open up, you know, kind of this little section on the right here, right? You go to View tab, Camera to View. We can close that stuff down if we want to. And just go to View here, Cameras, Active Camera, right? You can center the camera view, resizing the view to fit its bounds of the environment. I'm usually fine with this one, though, because I'm still getting exactly what I want. And now just Alt-Left rotates, Alt-Middle moves, and Alt-Right zooms. So I like kind of doing those things because then I can just use my navigation with the camera. And this is the render it's going to do, right? Now, to actually do the final kind of what resolution you're going to render, it's actually the third one down in the image properties, the one that looks like a printer. So if we click on that, you'll see how it's by default it's set to 1080, right? It's set to normal HD, 1080 to 1920. Obviously, if you want to set it to 4K, you can set it to 4K. You can even turn down the render percentage size so that you don't have to change these, but you can make it a smaller render. So sometimes if you want to go do a couple of test passes, like I'll do that for wireframe just to see how good the wireframe's coming out, I'll set it to like 30%. And then it'll render at 30% of this size, so it'll render a lot quicker without having to change those. So that's kind of a neat little control. So right here is kind of, boom, kind of those options. And then really what we do at this point, once we've got everything set up, is we can go to Render, Render Image, right? Render Image. And then what it's going to go through is it's going to go through and it's going to do this render and then add the denoising to it. And then what you can do is you can take it into Blender's Compositor if you've got like metal and you want to get that glare. You can take it into the Compositor to kind of actually do that, right? But this is how rendering works, right? You want to get a light on. You want to start using cycles. You have that little last kind of bar on there that gives you the full interactive preview renderer. Some of you guys remember from last year, Maya's Arnold did a fairly similar thing, although the Blender one's even more user-friendly because you can kind of interact right in the viewport there, click on stuff. It's a little more like Moto's. But you see we get this nice render, and eventually it's going to add denoising, right? Because you can kind of see in some areas you got a little bit of noise there, right? So that's what's cool about that denoiser. I do have a little bit of reflection on the floor. You could always just go in and turn your specular down to 0 in your material for the floor, right? If you don't want any reflection. In this case, it's subtle. It's not too big a deal, so we'll just leave it. But you'll see that you can get your final render from this scene as it goes along. Just got to wait for it to finish up, right? And of course, you could actually add a proper eyeball texture, but that would just be stenciling, right? You could always go darken up other areas, right? There's just certain areas that just kind of left for you guys to, hey, you could add that stuff easily just through multiply, right? A multiply with dark green, you can just kind of paint those little top nodules there. And eventually this render will be done, and you'll see it'll go through and it'll apply denoising. And so any noise you'll see in some areas will go away, and you get a really clean image. At this point, you can go to Image here, and you could save, right? So we could save it at whatever resolution we want. I like the JPEGs just because they open an... PNG actually opens the most stuff too, but JPEG's super safe. Let me just call this Quadruped final. There we go. And now that's saved, right? And of course, we could close up the Blender render. And if you go to compositing here, and you turn on use nodes, you'll be able to see everything, right? Usually if you go to compositing and use nodes is off, you won't see these. So you have to turn on use nodes. Another thing that we generally like to do is go to add, and in the output there's something called viewer, and you could actually click that in between these guys. So we'll drop it. Come on, should drop in there. Let's see here. Or I think we just take image here and plug it in image. There we go. So you just drop in what's called viewer, right? Add, output, viewer. And then what you could do is you could take this, which is our render layer, and you could plug this image into this one also so that you can kind of have the compositing node and the viewer node kind of all together to see what's going on here. And then what you could also do is things like add, filter, glare, and you can plug this in between, and then you see how you get the actual bloom. So the final render itself won't actually do bloom like Eevee will, so you have to kind of add this quick little compositor. What's cool though is you can actually have streaks, but you can also just go to fog glow, which kind of does more of our normal bloom, and then you can just play with the threshold for kind of how much it's going to do it. And you can play with the size of the pixels. And then if you like what you have here, you can go to rendering and you'll see it here. And you can click on this and you actually can go to viewer node and you can actually see the proper. So see how there's render result, but then there's viewer node and you can kind of see how the glares work. And if you had glow, you get the glow going. And then of course, what you could do is go to image, save, and you can save it again as kind of a new JPEG. And then you should actually have